to him, knocked him to the ground. Knocked him to the ground. And he came up. Now, to think of those that were with him, witnessing this. All of a sudden, this great light, down goes Paul. And they say, what happened to Paul? What's wrong? And they had to help him to get up. And now he can't see. Now he can't see. Paul knew God was dealing with him. Because what was the big words that he said? Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? I thought, oh, Lord, help each one of us individually to utter those same words. Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? For there's a work for everyone. I like this little one thing I found in one of the older quarterlies. God rarely calls us to heroic events. More often, he calls us to a task which appears to be insignificant. Yet, at the same time, it might be something which frightens us. We can't understand how a task so small and so frightening could be important to God. I suspect Ananias felt that way. Go to town, and Ananias at the same point in time was impressed by God to seek out who? Paul. Now, Ananias, you say from an earthly standpoint, had to be a fool, right? He's supposed to seek out Paul when he knows that Paul persecutes all the Christians and kills them. They were running and hiding. And here Ananias, is God lays on him, seek Paul out. And what was the most significant attribute? We're going to talk about attributes of Paul in a minute, of Paul. When if you read the scriptures, it says that Ananias said, go seek out Paul, for he will be praying. He will be praying. That in itself, I think, sent a strong message to Ananias saying, wow, something has happened to Paul, that he's praying. So Ananias went on a mission to find Paul. What a huge difference.
But I'm sure when God first told him, fear struck him.
Yep. Fear, exactly. Fear struck him. But you know something? Let me finish reading this. I suspect Ananias felt that way. God called him to go and lay his hands on Saul. It wasn't a large task, but it certainly was frightening. At first, he couldn't understand how to visit to his potential persecutor could advance the gospel. It was pretty scary to think of calling on a man who had come to town to arrest or execute you. What good could it do? Ananias' mission looked small, and it was certainly frightening, but it was indispensable. This forgotten disciple of Damascus performed a vital service to the kingdom of God. He went to Saul and welcomed the former persecutor as a brother in Christ. He affirmed his mission to the Gentiles. We all owe a great debt of thanks to Ananias. He was an essential link in the spreading of the gospel. There is no more important task in the world for you than the one God has placed in your hand. Whatever task God has placed in my hand, in your hand, do it.
But God also told him that he's my chosen vessel.
He's my chosen vessel. Yes, I believe that's true. Yes. Don't disregard what God has placed in your hands. Disregard your fears and do it. Now, I'd like to go now to some attributes of Paul. Try to go through these as expeditiously as possible. Character makes a great leader. Let me put down here first character. What is character?
Who you are, personality.
Who you really are when no one's around. Who you really are when no one's around. That's character. You know, some people, when someone's around, they put on a real good front. But when nobody's around, who you are. That's character. Character makes or breaks a leader because it either does or does not provide people with a compelling reason to follow. Vision gets people's attention, makes them think, and gets them excited. But unless the leader has the character to support the vision, people will remain skeptical and seek alternatives. In other words, vision is a wonderful thing. And oftentimes vision, okay, is what gets people started. But character is more important than vision. Who you are, truly who you are, is why people follow. Character. We all have often learned through painful experience that if you want to figure out where a leader is likely to take us, it is wiser to investigate his character than his public statements. Now, we hear there's a lot of false leaders. There's a lot of false religions. One of the things that I've done in the past and I continue to do is to research the background of many of these leaders. Who are they? Where'd they come from? And you'll find some real bad things, oftentimes. Think of the Mormons, for example. Not to sit here and talk about Mormons, but go back to their background. Research their background. Joseph Smith, okay, and the fact that he was put in prison because of multiple wives, not at all a Christian man. But he's their hero. Mary Eddy, okay, just keep on going. All the different isms today. Search their background and find out how they started. It'll tell you a whole lot. A man of character, the Apostle Paul did not seem to have so-called leadership charisma. That wasn't Paul. You know, some people have a lot of charisma, right? Just by they talking, people want to flock after them. Paul was a man of character. And that's why he got a following, because they knew he was true to his word. He was true. People were attracted to him because of the sheer force of his character. Some of the statements, okay, German scholars said there's no single person since Nero's days who has left permanent marks on the souls of men like Paul. F.F. Bruce, a commentator, there's no single person outside of Christ that's been more influential than Paul. Think of that. Outside of Christ, the most influential person in the world was Paul. James Stalker, a close student of Paul, said, the most influential teacher of mankind ever, other than Christ. Evan Lyman Abbott, the literary history of the world furnishes no parallel to the influence exerted by the writings of Paul. Another says, Paul was a tireless traveler, indomitable worker, a church founder, a theologian. He was all that and more. Okay, other characteristics. Yes, thank you, Barbara. We'll just write that up here a while, okay? Because I had that. Because of Paul's personality, you wouldn't think he was humble, but he was very humble. And humility doesn't in any way signify weakness. Strong people are humble. Persistent. Paul was converted in 34 AD, shortly after Christ's crucifixion. He was executed in Rome at 67 AD. Did not live a long life. Some 33 years, about the same lifespan as Christ himself, Paul lived. But to think of the 12,000 miles he traveled, all the things he confronted, all the things he faced, unbelievable. In 1956, the National Geographic magazine appeared an article, In the Steps of Paul. The Steps of Paul, in the 1956 National Geographic. Hundreds of miles were traversed by land. He missionaried in 50 cities. 50 cities. We'll jump down to humble, and we'll come back then. Paul's many character traits of Paul readily to be in the student, likely humility is not one of those. But the humble Paul is clearly there for the perceptive leader. Who was Paul's companion Barnabas. They settled for a while in Antioch of Syria. Certain men of Judea arrived. They were teaching a Judaistic gospel. Paul knew the sensitivity of the situation. And one of the things that's very amazing of Paul, he was such an intellect that he could read a scenario, okay, that wasn't good, and knew exactly how to respond to that scenario because of his humility and intellect. The sensitive apostle knew that this was a volatile situation. There was false teachers coming into the church. If the Christians in Antioch felt the need of consulting the broader band of apostolic authority, Paul would not insist on thrusting him. He said, I'll just let them do their research, rather than Paul just jump in and say, hold up, stop here. Paul was very, how would you say, he knew what was going through their heads. And he knew how to confront it in a very careful way. Paul did not want to thrust himself in the forefront. He knew Jesus and the gospel was more important occasion than his own ego. Now, sometimes our ego jumps in, right? Paul kept his ego out of it. He would humbly recede into the shadows for a moment. You'll find that in 1 Corinthians 9:12. This was the last time that his gracious servant of Christ would yield to a matter of expediency for the sake of the kinsman in the Lord. So humility was a significant trait of Paul. Here's another one. We'll come back here. Patience. Can you see Paul's a patient man? Hardly, right? When the militant persecutor of Christ was brought to the Lord by the means of the gospel, he was informed that he would be an instrument of mercy to all men. He would be an instrument of mercy, and that's in Acts chapter 9, which is the lesson today, 22 and 26. He would be an instrument of mercy to all men, especially to the Gentiles in Acts 9:15. It's not unreasonable to assume that Paul's earlier training contributed to the amazing patience he exhibited in his letters to fledgling churches, whose problems he attempted to address. So he was patient, knew when to exercise patience. Aggressive, zeal, determination, yes, but knew how to exercise patience. That's quite a character, intellect, right? And when to push ahead, when to pull back. We got persistent, not yet. Paul was converted. Okay, yeah, we did talk about that a little bit.
I would say spirit-filled.
Spirit-filled, yes, exactly. Let's look at another one that's huge. Courageous. Paul, even though perhaps down inside at times had butterflies, he was never afraid. Never afraid. In Corinth, the Lord spoke to his apostle in night visions, cautioning, be not afraid. In other words, the fact that God spoke to him and said, be not afraid in Acts 18:9 says that inside there were some butterflies. But God says, be not afraid. The force of the Greek expression is stop being afraid. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is doing what is right when you're afraid. Doing what is right when you're afraid. Paul was stoned, dragged outside of the city, and left for dead. Wow. But after the stoning was done, Paul got up. And he went through a miraculous recovery. The following day, he and Barnabas left the city, proceeding toward Derbe, some 60 miles to the southeast. He was a battered apostle full of courage. Now, some people, when they go through that kind of battling, will say, I give up, I'm done. Paul got up, wiped himself off, so to speak, and ever onward. No stopping Paul. Patient, courageous. Let's see if we can find any others here. Uncompromising. Big word. Uncompromising. To suggest that Paul was the epitome of humility, it was not to affirm that he was a pushover or a compromiser of truth. Not in the slightest. Galatians 2:1. Misguided members of the congregation were secretly brought in false brothers. Another occasion, Paul was in Antioch of Syria. Peter arrived on the scene. Oh, here's an interesting one. Peter arrived on the scene. What happened? You'll find this in Galatians 2:11. Who was the stronger, Peter or Paul? Galatians 2:11 says, Paul confronted Peter to the face. Wow.
He was committed, devoted to teaching.
He learned that Peter had yielded to Jewish prejudice and withdrew from a Gentile association. Peter was influenced by some pressures. Paul said, I resisted him to the face because he stood condemned. Wow. Pretty strong words. And who backed down? Peter backed down and said, whoops. Now from that point on, they were, no. No, they didn't bump heads. Paul would not have the truth compromised and the cause of Christ endangered by weak church members who give in to social pressure. In other words, don't give in to social pressure. Stand where you stand and say, here I stand. I'm not going to give in to social pressure. This unpleasant situation, Paul later commended the support of Barnabas, and Peter writes later on in 2 Peter 3:15, my beloved brother Paul. Wow. What a commendation from Peter after Paul just confronted him to the face. For the sake of time, Paul was yielding. Another great quality. Backbone of steel in doctrinal matters, but yielding. When coping with a stubborn anti-Paul faction within the church, 1 Corinthians 1 and 4, the apostle was forced to defend himself against malicious charges hurled against him. He says there, I brought myself under bondage to all that I may gain the more. I brought myself to bondage to all that I may gain the more, yielding. And lastly, Paul was ethical. You know, there's always the right thing to do. Think of all the issues in today's world, the issues. And I said, if there's anything that we should have learned from the Penn State situation that happened up there, is there's always the right thing to do. And when you're confronted with a situation that may seem, there's the right thing to do. Paul, being ethical, always chose the right thing to do.
He was faithful and committed.
Let me give you one scenario. Thank you, Barbara. Onesimus. Onesimus was a servant to who? Philemon. Okay? And Onesimus and Philemon, apparently Onesimus did something horribly wrong and left Philemon and went to Rome. Well, who do you think he encountered in Rome? Paul. And what do you think happened to Onesimus? Onesimus got saved through Paul's ministry to Onesimus. And what did Paul do? Onesimus, the right thing to do is what? Go back to Philemon. Go back. As a matter of fact, he wrote the letter and said to Onesimus, carried back to Philemon. And Onesimus did that. Did Philemon accept him? Yes, he did. But see how the right thing to do, Paul said to Onesimus, take this letter back to Philemon. Even though you left him, you did him wrong, you were in the wrong, he will accept you now because now you're a Christian. Interesting, isn't it? Also, Paul was forgiving. He says in the final end, may this not be laid to their charge. And that's in 2 Timothy 4:16. Now, we basically have hit the lesson context without reading all the verses, but Paul, breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord, went into the high priest, desired of him letters to Damascus, that we talked about, that all the Christians be persecuted. And then he struck to the earth there in verse 4. Who art thou, Lord? It's hard to kick against the pricks. He, trembling and astonished, said, Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And the Lord said, arise and go into the city, and it shall be told there what thou must do. In other words, this one, Ananias, is all prepared to find you, because God spoke to Ananias. Everybody was speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. Saul got up from the earth, and when he opened his eyes, he saw no man. But they led him by the hand and brought him to Damascus. He was there how many days without sight? Or either 3 days. Couldn't see, didn't eat, did not drink. And there Ananias was commissioned by the Lord to go find this Paul who will be praying. Wow. And the Lord said to him, arise and go into the street which is called Straight, and inquire at the house of Judas for one called Saul of Tarsus, for he prayeth, and hath seen in a vision a man named Ananias coming in and putting his hand on him, and he might receive his sight. Then Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard by many of this man how much evil he hath done to thy saints at Jerusalem. And here he hath authority over from the chief priests to bind all that call on thy name. He said, just a minute, God, you're asking me to go find Paul, who everybody's running from. Are you sure, God, you want me to do that? Mm-hmm. And the Lord said unto him, go thy way, for he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how great things he must suffer for my name's sake. What a change. What a huge change. Here Paul, one day is a persecutor of the Christian, and a couple of days hence, what he's doing? He's preaching the gospel. What a stunning change. Unbelievable.
But once you're touched by Christ, you're never the same.
All things passed away and all things become new. You're never the same once touched by Christ. Very, 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 very true there on that statement. Very, very accurate. Paul, saved to serve. Some other attributes of Paul, we're not going to put on the board, but self-discipline. Self-discipline. Grace. Grace. A servant. A servant. A shepherd's heart. A team builder. A team builder. Deeply, as Barbara mentioned, deeply spiritual. Very deeply spiritual. Cultural relevance. In other words, when Paul was in amongst the Jews, he could relate to them. When he was amongst the Gentiles, he could relate to them. He was culturally relevant. No matter what the audience was, he knew exactly how to adapt his message to that audience. Culturally relevant. A man of tremendous vision. Tremendous vision. A man that was a strategic thinker. You know, sometimes we make our plans for the here and now. But more important than that is make our plans strategically for the future. Paul was a strategic thinker, thinking this message got to get out because this will have an impact on the world. Just think if we didn't have the Apostle Paul in his writings, where we would be. Wow. But most important, as we've already mentioned, of all his great attributes is the one called prayer. Main characteristic of Paul. And what does he say in 1 Thessalonians 5:17? It's a tremendous verse. Pray without ceasing. What does that mean? As a Christian, we should be in an attitude of prayer 24/7. You know, many times, and maybe you do too, I'm driving along, maybe by myself, and it's a good time to pray. With your eyes open, by the way. One open and one closed, right? But no, pray without ceasing. Ananias looking for Paul, God said, look for him, for he will be praying when you find him. And I thought, Lord, help us to be praying 24/7, because God's looking for a few good men, a few good women, and those attributes should be the key attribute, which is prayer. Prayer.
He was also compassionate.
Compassionate.
He had a heart for bringing the lost to Christ.
Had a heart to bring a lost to Christ, yes. He was a shepherd. Amen. Bringing in the lost sheep. Well, thank you for your participation, your kind attention. Lord bless you richly. We have one more lesson, and then we go to a different series of lessons. But next lesson, next week, is on Dorcas. Okay, one of the great women of the Bible. So Lord bless you richly, okay? And hang around, stay here for the after service. Lord bless you.